Here is something that almost no history book written for general audiences will ever tell you. In the year 1614, a group of Japanese samurai walked through the streets of Mexico City, not as prisoners, not as curiosities, as a diplomatic mission. Armed, formidable, led by a battle-hardened warrior who had fought in Japan's invasion of Korea, they crossed Mexico from Acapulco to Veracruz. They walked hundreds of kilometers through Colonial New Spain. They caused fights in port cities. They made Europeans who encountered them write in extraordinary detail about their composure, their discipline, and their weapons. But that is just one specific group, because behind that diplomatic mission, on the same trade routes that had been operating since 1565, tens of thousands of Asian migrants, including documented Japanese, including men described in colonial records as being of samurai lineage, were arriving in Mexico, settling in its cities, serving in its militias, running its businesses, and climbing its social ladders. They were there. The colonial records prove it. The history books forgot them. This is why. To understand how Japanese samurai ended up walking through colonial Mexico, you first need to understand the road that connected Japan to the Americas. That road was silver. In 1545, Spanish colonists in the Andes discovered a single mountain, so massively concentrated with silver ore that it transformed the entire global economy. The mines of Potosi, in what is now Bolivia, would eventually produce roughly half of all the silver in the world during the 16th and 17th centuries. Enormous wealth extracted by enslaved indigenous and African laborers working in conditions of almost unimaginable brutality. That silver needed somewhere to go, and where it went, more than anywhere else, was China. The Ming dynasty had a voracious appetite for silver, and the goods that Chinese workshops produced, silk, porcelain, lacquerware, were exactly what the Spanish colonial aristocracy wanted to buy. The match was perfect. Silver from the Americas flowing west, Asian luxury goods flowing east, two enormous economies on opposite sides of the planet, perfectly complementary in their needs. Starting in 1565, enormous galleons made the crossing between Acapulco on the Pacific coast of Mexico and Manila in the Spanish Philippines, once or twice a year. They were the largest ships in the world at that time, crossing 6,000 miles of open Pacific. And on those ships, along with the silver going west and the silk coming east, came people. The numbers are astonishing. During the 17th and 18th centuries, between 40,000 and 100,000 Asian immigrants arrived in colonial Mexico via the Manila galleons. Filipino, Chinese, Japanese, South Asian, Malay, all called Chinos in the colonial records, a bureaucratic term that simultaneously acknowledged their presence and deliberately obscured their individual origins. Among these people were Japanese. Some came as merchants. Some came as Christians fleeing religious persecution that intensified dramatically after 1614. Some came as skilled craftsmen. Some came with specifically martial backgrounds, and all of them were doing something that should have been impossible in a colony built on rigid racial hierarchy. Asians were the only non-white people in colonial Mexico licensed to carry weapons and serve in the colonial militia. In colonial Mexico, the racial hierarchy was brutally enforced. Indigenous people could not carry weapons. Enslaved Africans could not carry weapons. Mixed-race people faced extensive restrictions. And yet Asians were incorporated into the colonial militia as armed defenders of Spanish colonial interests. Why? Because the Pacific coast was vulnerable. Dutch and English pirates attacked the Manila galleons. Bandits preyed on the roads between Acapulco and Mexico City. The Spanish colonial government needed soldiers who could fight, and the men who had arrived from the Philippines and Japan, many of whom had genuine military experience, were exactly the kind of people colonial administrators needed. From at least the 1590s, Asian militia members were routinely patrolling the roads near Acapulco, clearing them of bandits while on patrol, and most importantly, playing a heroic role in resisting an English pirate invasion at the port of Zihuatanejo in 1741. Japanese men were patrolling the roads of colonial Mexico. They were fighting pirates. They were defending Spanish colonial interests with weapons that no other non-white people in the colony were legally permitted to carry. This is not legend. This is in the colonial archives. But the story does not stop at soldiers and militia members. because among the Asian migrants in colonial Mexico were people who climbed the social ladder in ways that the colonial racial hierarchy was theoretically designed to prevent. In the city of Guadalajara, the notarial archives contain one of the most remarkable social biographies in the history of Japanese overseas migration. His Spanish name was Luis de Encillo. His Japanese name was Soemon Fukuchi. In a document from 1634, he is described as being of the Japanese nation. This man established himself in Guadalajara's commercial community and rose to extraordinary prominence. In 1643, at the peak of his fortunes, he was granted a monopoly over coconut and mezcal sales across the entire Guadalajara region. A monopoly, not just permission to trade, an exclusive commercial right granted by Spanish colonial authorities to a Japanese man in a city hundreds of kilometers from any port. His son-in-law, born in Osaka, was even more successful. He became the administrator of the tributes collected by the Catholic Church across the entire region of New Galicia. For 2 decades, a man born in Osaka managed the finances of one of the most powerful Catholic institutions in northwestern Mexico. These men were converts to Catholicism. They had Spanish names. They operated within Spanish commercial and legal frameworks. And because they did all of these things competently, the racial hierarchy that should have kept them subordinate found accommodations for them that it denied to almost everyone else who was not of Spanish descent. Now, all of this is the background story. But there is one story that stands above all the others. The story of the samurai diplomat who crossed 2 oceans and a continent to present letters to the King of Spain and the Pope. In 1612, a minor samurai named Hasakura Tsunanaga found himself in disgrace. His father had been convicted of corruption and executed. His lands were confiscated. Under Japanese feudal rules, he should have shared his father's fate, but a powerful one-eyed Japanese warlord named Date Masamune had other plans. He was one of the most remarkable figures in Japanese history, a brilliant military commander and a man of genuine cosmopolitan ambition. He wanted to establish direct trade between his domain and colonial New Spain, bypassing the Portuguese and Dutch intermediaries who controlled Japan's foreign trade. He would send an embassy directly to the King of Spain and the Pope. And he chose Hasakura Tsunanaga, a man with everything to prove and nothing to lose, to lead it. Date Masamune built a ship, not a borrowed ship, a specifically constructed 500-ton galleon, the largest ship ever built in Japan at that time. Built in just 45 days by a workforce that included 800 shipwrights, 700 smiths, and 3,000 carpenters. On October 28, 1613, this galleon set sail from Japan with 180 people aboard, 140 Japanese, including 22 samurai, and 40 Spanish and Portuguese crew. 3 months later, on January 25, 1614, they sailed into the harbor at Acapulco. The delegation's stay in Acapulco was not without incident. Spanish colonial officials had to issue emergency orders because of fights between Japanese visitors and local Spaniards. The samurai who did not cross the Pacific to be managed made that clear. After those disputes were resolved, the delegation began its overland journey across New Spain. They walked from Acapulco to Mexico City, hundreds of kilometers through colonial Mexico, through towns and villages, where they were quite probably the first Japanese people the residents had ever seen. Spanish observers along the route wrote in extraordinary detail about their swords, that the blades were so perfectly honed they could cut paper by mere contact with the edge. These observations circulated through colonial society and eventually reached Europe, where they were repeated until the samurai sword had acquired a legendary reputation that persists in popular culture to this day. In Mexico City, the delegation was received by the Viceroy of New Spain. They waited months while colonial bureaucracy processed their mission, 6 months in total, during which Japanese samurai were living in the colonial capital of the most valuable overseas territory Spain possessed, observing its institutions, its defenses, its mining operations. From Mexico City, they traveled to Veracruz. Then they sailed to Cuba, becoming the first Japanese people ever to set foot on that island. Then across the Atlantic toward Spain. When bad weather forced their ship to shelter at Saint-Tropez on the French coast, Hasakura Tsunanaga became the first Japanese person ever to set foot on French soil. The delegation arrived in Madrid on December 20, 1614. On January 30, 1615, Hasekura Tsunanaga had his audience with King Philip III of Spain, a Japanese samurai. Born in northeastern Japan, trained as a warrior, his family's honor riding on every moment of this mission, stood in the Royal Alcazar of Madrid and presented letters from his lord to one of the most powerful monarchs in the world. He then continued to Rome, where in November 1615 he was granted Roman citizenship. A Japanese samurai became a Roman citizen in 1615 in the same city where Galileo was being questioned by the Inquisition that same year. The world in 1615 was a stranger and more connected place than most people realize. The letters that Hasekura delivered to the Pope, written in Japan in 1613, carried across the Pacific to Mexico, across Mexico overland, across the Atlantic to Spain, through France to Italy, still exist in the Vatican archives today. But the mission failed. Neither the King of Spain nor the Pope granted the trade agreement Date Masamune wanted. Both were already receiving disturbing reports about the persecution of Christians in Japan, and both were reluctant to commit to a relationship with a country that was simultaneously requesting missionaries and imprisoning the ones already there. While Hasekura was sailing across the Pacific in 1613, while he was walking through New Spain in 1614, while he was presenting letters to European monarchs in 1615, the political situation at home was deteriorating for everything his mission represented. Japan issued an edict ordering the expulsion of all Christian missionaries and the persecution of Japanese Christian converts. The policy that Date Masamune had been counting on as diplomatic leverage was being dismantled by his own government, while his ambassador was presenting it as an asset to the King of Spain. Hasekura spent 7 years away from Japan. He crossed the Pacific twice, the Atlantic once. He traversed Mexico twice, Spain twice, Cuba once. He returned to Japan in 1620. The Japan he returned to had changed dramatically. Christianity was now officially persecuted. The trade agreement was politically impossible. His mission was formally recorded as a failure. Within a few years of his return, members of his own family were caught up in the anti-Christian purges and persecuted for the religion that his mission had been sent to encourage. He died in 1622, the extraordinary achievement officially unacknowledged. But in Spain, the story had a different ending. In the small town of Coria del Rio, near Seville, in southern Spain, some members of Hasekura's mission chose not to return to Japan. They stayed. They married local women. They raised families. Approximately 700 inhabitants of Coria del Rio today bear the surname Japan, as a direct inheritance from samurai who arrived 4 centuries ago and never went home, not as a legend or a myth, as a documented genealogical reality, traceable through church records from the 17th century to the present day. And then, gradually, systematically, the memory of all of this was erased. Why did history forget? The first layer is Japanese policy. The period of Japanese isolation that lasted from approximately 1635 to 1853 made the mission not merely forgotten, but actively inconvenient. A government that was systematically closing Japan to the outside world had no interest in commemorating an embassy that had been sent specifically to open Japan to trade with Catholic Spain. The mission disappeared from Japanese historical consciousness so completely that when a new Japanese embassy visited Europe in 1873, Japanese officials were astonished to discover that Spain and Italy had detailed records of their predecessors. Japan had forgotten. Europe had not. The second layer is Mexican history. The social amnesia with respect to Mexico's Asian heritage was not an accident. As the Manila galleon trade declined in the 18th century, the Spanish colonial system periodically attempted to reinforce racial categories that practical realities of the galleon trade had allowed to blur. Asians who had acquired Spanish names, converted to Catholicism, and integrated into colonial society found their origins erased, their descendants absorbed into the broader population without the Asian ancestry being acknowledged. The third layer is the story that Mexico told about itself after independence. The Mexican national identity, built after 1821, was constructed on specific pillars: indigenous civilization, Spanish colonial heritage, and the mestizo synthesis of the two. A powerful and meaningful narrative, but one that left a room for Asian contribution. The Aztec and the conquistador, the indigenous mother and the Spanish father. This was the foundational mythology. The Japanese merchants of Guadalajara, the Asian militia members of the Pacific Coast, the samurai who walked through Acapulco and Mexico City. They fit none of the categories that the national narrative required, and so they were forgotten. They were there. The documents prove it. In the notarial archives of Guadalajara, the testament of Soyman Fukuchi still exists, written in Spanish, by a man born in Japan, in a Mexican city 400 years ago. The document identifies him as of the Japanese nation, in Mexico. In 1634, in the Colonial archives of Mexico City, the militia licensing documents still exist. Licenses to carry swords granted to men described as Asian in the terminology of the time. Licenses granted specifically because these men had demonstrated military competence that the colonial administration found useful. In the Vatican archives, the letters from Date Masamune still sit in their folders. Written in 1613 in Japan, requesting trade with Mexico, carried to Rome by a samurai who crossed 2 oceans and a continent to deliver them. In Correa del Rio in Spain, people named Japon are still living in the town where their ancestors settled 4 centuries ago, having decided not to return to a Japan that was closing itself off from the world. And in the genes of modern Mexicans, detectable by molecular analysis, dated to approximately 1620 by the rate of genetic drift, the biological legacy of the Asian community that helped build colonial Mexico. Not just the documents, the actual DNA. What this story is really about, beneath the extraordinary drama of the samurai diplomat, beneath the remarkable social history of Japanese migrants in colonial Mexico, is the actual nature of the early modern world. The world in the 16th and 17th centuries was more connected, more cosmopolitan, more genuinely globalized than most people today understand. The Manila galleon trade was not a footnote in the story of early modern history. It was a central artery of the first global economy, connecting East Asia to the Americas to Europe in a continuous circuit of goods, money, and people that began in 1565 and ran for 2.5 centuries. And in that circuit, people from every corner of Asia, including Japan, including samurai, ended up in Mexico, not in ones and twos as exotic curiosities, but in tens of thousands as participants in a colonial economy that needed their labor, their skills, their commercial knowledge, and occasionally their martial ability. History books do not just forget things accidentally. They forget things because those things do not fit the story that someone, at some point, decided was worth telling. The Japanese in colonial Mexico did not fit any of those stories, but they were there, and now you know.